Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Sir John Quick Lecture, which is finally back live after 3 years of COVID hibernation. My name is Fiona Kelly, and I'm Dean of La Trobe University Law School, and I'll be your host this evening. We'll commence the evening with a welcome to country delivered by Jackson Dunley Lee. Jackson is a direct descendant of the great Thomas Dunley, who was born on Dja Dja Wurrung country around 1854. Like many Aboriginal children born during this early frontier period, Thomas was given the name of the place where he was born. Jackson is a passionate Dja Dja Wurrung man born on country, and he has lived on country for all of his life. Please join me in welcoming Jackson Dunley Lee.
Hello everyone, my name's Jackson Dunley Lee. I'm a proud Dja man. Dja Dja country is made up of many clan groups, smaller clan groups made up of family groups. Dja Dja country can be seen as a language group, a people that speak a very similar dialect, and they're even part of even a larger Kulin nation. These clan groups were very important to maintain their connections between, because they were often family groups. They would often marry between the groups and trade, but also just trade resources and share resources. Between these clan groups, it was very important when visiting each other. It was very important that a welcome to country would be done. And this is a very old ceremony that our people have done for a very long time. It's a cultural protocol, and just as much today as it was back then. Traditionally, if you wanted to visit a clan group within Dja Dja country, there'll be a ceremony involved, and the main point of it is to not only just welcome those people to your area, but often bringing them into who you are, because your country was who you were as a person. And so, oftentimes it meant a lot more than just welcoming someone from a land to another land. It also is welcoming them into your family, and is also asking your ancestors, who are also the custodians of that land, to keep those people safe and wish them well while they're on country. And so, with that being said, I'd like to say, Bengak Waitaka Noten Dja Dja Wurrung Jari and Delk Murup, which means, I welcome you all to Dja Dja country, and I wish you good spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackson, for welcoming us to your country. Tonight, we are here to enjoy the 2023 Sir John Quick Lecture, but also to celebrate 150 years of tertiary education in Bendigo. The 150 years of tertiary education in Bendigo celebration is a joint project between La Trobe University, Bendigo TAFE, and the Bendigo Tertiary Education Anniversary Foundation. The overarching project aims to celebrate our achievements, history, and alumni, as well as the antecedent organisations that came before La Trobe University and Bendigo TAFE. The theme of the 150 celebrations is the transformational impact of education, something that La Trobe Law School witnesses regularly in our student body, and that was also a passion of Sir John Quick. A law degree opens an almost unlimited number of doors for students, perhaps even more so for regional students. Over the 10 years that I have been at La Trobe Law School, the most notable change I've seen in our Bendigo law student body is that they are now much more likely to choose to commence their legal careers in Bendigo and neighbouring communities. In the past, success was defined narrowly as relocation to Melbourne. But now our students aspire to remain in the regions and to serve the communities that they grew up in. By committing to careers in regional Victoria, they ensure that all Victorians have access to high-quality lawyers and ultimately access to justice. I now have the honour of introducing Professor Emerita Anne Twomey, who will deliver the 2023 Sir John Quick Lecture. It is a great honour to have Professor Twomey speaking tonight, given her expertise in constitutional law matters and the impending national referendum on an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. There is no more important time in Australian history to have access to reliable sources of information about the decision we are about to make as a nation. Professor Twomey is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney Law School, where she taught constitutional law for many years. She has also previously worked for the High Court of Australia, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Research Service, the Senate Legal and Constitutional Committee, and the Cabinet Office of New South Wales. She was also a member of the Commonwealth Government's Constitution Expert Group on the Voice referendum. Professor Twomey is also somewhat of a local, though she told me that due to transport, not as much of a local as I anticipated. She grew up in regional Victoria, but in Shepparton, and she has a strong appreciation of the importance of education outside of the capital cities. Tonight, Professor Twomey will speak to us about what history tells us about Australians and referendums. Throughout the lecture, you're invited to submit questions via Slido using the back of the program where there's a QR code. We'll then select a small number of questions at the end of the lecture to ask to Professor Twomey. So please join me in welcoming Professor Twomey to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's just delightful to be back in regional Victoria, although, as said, slightly further away from where I grew up, but still, I very much enjoy being in this part of the world. Now, one of the fascinating things about the framers of the Constitution is that so many of them came from extreme childhood disadvantage and poverty. It was perhaps this that gave them the resilience and the drive to achieve federation against all the odds. For example, Sir Henry Parkes worked as a child as a road labourer and in a brick pit. Henry Bourne-Higgins worked in a warehouse as a child. Paddy Glynn was often homeless and hungry and made ends meet by being a travelling salesman of sewing machines. But I think John Quick had the worst of all of them. He was, as your programs tell you, stealing my thunder slightly, born in Cornwall in 1852, and he travelled with his parents to Australia at the age of 2 as part of the Victorian gold rush. Now, his parents settled in the goldfields of what was then known as Sandhurst, so Bendigo, but his father died shortly thereafterwards of typhoid fever, and this left his mother, a single mother, with a young child in a very, very rough landscape. Quick had little formal education. He had to leave school at the age of 10 to support his family, and he did so by working in hard manual labour, in an iron foundry initially and then in a mine. And his job was to stoke the fire on an engine and to fan the heat of the casting furnace, which was really hot and dangerous work for a child. His workday started at 6 a.m, but he still used his evenings for studying, and he attended Sunday school. It was the attending of Sunday school that actually helped change his life, because there he met a man called Mr. Harcourt, who gave him a job instead in the print room of a Bendigo newspaper. And while he was there, he saw a reporter's notebook, which had what he described as mystic squiggles in it. And these mystic squiggles were shorthand. And he was so fascinated by the shorthand that he decided to teach himself shorthand. Now, Harcourt was very impressed by Quick being able to do this, and although he didn't have a job on his own newspaper for a new reporter, he recommended Quick to another newspaper to become a reporter on the Bendigo Independent, and Quick got the job. Now, as a reporter, Quick wrote about legal cases in court and about politics, and he became very interested in both law and politics. He eventually moved to Melbourne and succeeded in the university entrance exams. He won scholarships, he studied law at the University of Melbourne, and he graduated with first-class honours as a lawyer by the age of 25. Now, that's just an extraordinary journey for someone who left school at the age of 10. A qualified lawyer with first-class honours by the age of 25. Now, Quick became the lead parliamentary reporter for the Melbourne Age, and there he became acquainted with politicians of all stripes and became intensely interested in politics. And through that, he was asked to stand for the parliamentary seat in Bendigo by the Berry government. He did so, and he won, and he returned permanently to Bendigo to live, where he also set up a legal practice. Now, perhaps it was his sense of loss of having to leave school so early that drove him on, but Quick actually then went and completed a doctorate in law at the University of Melbourne by the age of 30, which is why he's known as Dr. Quick. Quick also supported education locally in Bendigo. He provided assistance to the Bendigo School of Mines, which is one of the early ancestors of this university in Bendigo, and he became one of its trustees. Quick was also very passionate about literature, so he became the president of the Shakespeare Society here, as well as the Pickwick Society. Now, it was at a party to celebrate the award of his doctorate in Bendigo that Quick's fate again changed. The Premier, Graham Berry, attended that party along with an up-and-coming politician called Alfred Deakin. Now, Berry, in a speech, urged both Deakin and Quick to take up the cause of Australian Federation. He advised foresight, persistence, and adherence to the principles of democratic government as the foundations for that campaign. He concluded that no nobler work could engage the attention of young men in Australia. Quick was inspired. He now had a mission. But his career as a Member of Parliament was thwarted when in 1889 there was a redistribution which reduced the numbers of seats in Bendigo and he lost his seat in Parliament. His constituents clearly appreciated him because they held a meeting to thank him for his work as a Member of Parliament and give him a gift. And in his speech in response to that, he said this: "I am of those who believe that if a man be beaten in one quarter of the field of life and action, he should endeavour to convert that defeat into a victory in another direction, or to put the same idea into the words of Lord Tennyson, that men may rise on stepping stones of their dead selves to higher things," which I think is a very beautiful way of putting it. So Quick returned to his legal practice, but for him the higher thing that he was aiming at was success in federation. His defeat in Parliament was no more than the stepping stone that gave him the extra time he needed to devote to the federal cause. The 1891 Constitutional Convention had debated and drafted a constitution for federation of the Australian colonies, but the flaw in the plan was that no one had actually worked out what to do next. The Constitution was then sent off to the various colonial parliaments for them to approve or ask the people to approve or do something. Nobody actually knew and had planned for this. But politics got in the way, and the issue of federation was neglected when other pressing issues, including a very major financial crisis, arose. Now, in New South Wales, the main supporter of federation, Sir Henry Parkes, had also lost office. The government needed the support of the Labor Party in order to govern, and Labor was opposed to federation. So federation was just dumped in the too hard basket. But the financial depression of 1893 led people to realise that the economies of the various colonies in Australia were interlinked, and that there would be a significant advantage in removing the barriers to trade between them. As Quick and his erstwhile colleague Robert Garran, who later wrote a book in 1901, said, "Federation began to appeal to the pocket as well as to the heart." In July 1893, Parkes gave a speech at Liverpool. He argued that for a new constitution to be valid, it would need to be adopted by each of the colonies. But in saying this, he focused on the parliaments of the colonies, not the people. He also contended that a new convention would be needed to hammer out the changes that were suggested by the colonial parliaments. Quick, however, thought there were missing links in Parkes's scheme. Parkes had said nothing about how that convention would be legally convened. He made no mention of a referendum of the people. He said nothing about the principle of one man, one vote. Parkes was the venerable voice of the past, but there were now new men, such as Quick and Deakin, for whom it was imperative to hear the voices of the people. Now, to start with, those voices were represented by a popular movement, bringing people together in federation leagues, particularly along the border towns along the Murray, separating New South Wales and Victoria. Now, Quick later wrote this. He said, "With a good cause and able leaders, men may exercise as much influence out of office as in office. Never was this better exemplified than in the progress of the cause of Australian Federation at this stage of its history. There grew up groups of men out of Parliament, but animated by patriotic impulses and interest in the common cause of federation, who thought that the time had arrived when national unity should be made a people's cause and should be no longer dependent on the battledore and shuttlecock of colonial parliamentary parties." Now, if any of you are wondering what on earth battledore is, I have to say I did look it up on the computer, and apparently it was an original form of badminton. But the gist of it was, instead of having political parties, which I think you could see the analogies with here, right, with the voice, instead of having political parties battling and hitting things over a net, he wanted the people to be the ones that were the ballast for constitutional change. Now, representatives of these federation leagues, as well as the Australian Natives Association, met in Corowa on the 31st of July and the 1st of August of 1893 to advance the cause of federation. There was great enthusiasm, there were many fine speeches and resolutions, but some in the audience became restless and said, "Look, this is just not enough." In the end, a rather frustrated delegate called Herbert Barrett got up to say, "This was words, words, words," which, by the way, is a phrase from Shakespeare, so Quick probably would have appreciated that. But he said, "Words, words, words, can't we do anything?" And this was the key tipping point. Quick called for a short recess, and half a dozen people joined him in a side room as they worked out a plan of action. Within 30 minutes, which if one was into puns, one could say was rather quick, Quick was back, presenting to the conference the Corowa plan, and it had 3 critical steps. First, instead of a constitutional convention chosen by parliaments, like the last one, there would be a public election of representatives to a new constitutional convention, and this would give the people direct involvement in the process, and in doing so, start them actively thinking about federation. Second, once the new constitution was completed by the convention, it would be put to the people in a referendum for their approval. And third, the whole process from start to finish would be set out in advance in a law enacted by the Parliament of each colony. And this would mean that from the very start, there would be a required process that would run all the way through to the finish, so you wouldn't have the whole thing getting lost again. John Quick and his fellow author Robert Garran later explained, "Those who had jested at the Convention of 1891 as a body of men engaged in the amiable and amusing task of drawing up a constitution for the waste paper basket would have to admit that there was something serious about a constitution which, when framed, the government would be obliged by law to submit to the electors for their acceptance or rejection." The people too were aware that they had a crucial role in this process. When they voted for their representatives in the Constitutional Convention, as Garran later remarked, they knew the gun was loaded, and they would later then be called upon to approve the resulting constitution. Now, from a political point of view, this plan was of fundamental importance to Australia. Even though for legal reasons the Constitution was always going to end up being enacted by the British Parliament, the great innovation here was to require the approval of the people first. This meant that many decades later, when the High Court of Australia was considering the question as to where sovereignty lies in Australia, it could say that while the legal source of power was the British Parliament, the political source of power, of sovereignty, was the people themselves acting in the exercise of popular sovereignty. It was John Quick who laid out the plan for that exercise of political sovereignty, which has had such a huge effect ever since. Now, a few days after the Corowa Conference, the Argus newspaper published an article that asked, well, who would frame the bill for the various parliaments authorising and constituting this convention, and who would push the measure on? It was all very well to have a plan, but someone needed to drive it and ensure it was implemented. Now, on reading that article, Quick realised he was the man. He drafted an Australian Federal Congress bill and presented it to federation leagues and to politicians, and relentlessly pushed the acceptance of the Corowa Plan across the Australian colonies. Quick's proposal was eventually supported at a Premier's Conference in Hobart on the 3rd of January 1895. It resolved that there be a convention of 10 representatives directly elected by the voters of each colony, and that it be charged with framing a federal constitution. The constitution, once finalised, would then be submitted to the people for acceptance or rejection in a referendum, and if approved by 3 or more colonies, it would then be sent to the Queen with a request that it be passed by the Imperial Parliament. Now, the Premiers agreed that a draft bill would then be prepared by the Premiers of Victoria and South Australia to give effect to the bill. So Quick himself had devised a bill, but actually the final version was slightly different, but nonetheless still followed the Corowa Plan. And that bill was later adopted by the conference, and with it being enacted in various colonies, not all of them. Queensland didn't bother because it was having an internal fight. Western Australia wasn't terribly sure about the idea of democracy, and so decided to appoint its members, but the rest of them followed the plan and enacted the legislation. Now, this proposal did not gain universal support. Sir Henry Parkes, for example, criticised it. He seemed to resent the idea that a new constitution would be framed instead of using the 1891 version, which he had all his fingerprints on. He argued, it is preposterous to talk of a mob of people making a constitution for the state. A constitution must be framed by persons most fitted to frame it. That was Parkes's view. Now, Parkes did not have the same faith in the people that Quick did. He preferred, quote, a convention of statesmen, elected for that special purpose by all the parliaments of Australia. 2 months later, however, Parkes died. Quick and Garran observed, the adherents of the parliamentary system had thought that the people would be less likely than the parliaments to select men who by ability and training were most suited for the work of constitution making. But they had forgotten that more important even than the personnel of the convention was the public confidence in the convention. The results showed that the chosen representatives of the people were, for the most part, those who probably would have been chosen as representatives by the Parliament anyway. But from the fact of their election by the people, they had a power and they enjoyed a confidence which election by parliaments could never have given them. That was the view of Quick and Garran. Quick also noted that the convention was not a place for brilliant orators who could sway the multitudes. The federal movement had passed beyond the need for oratorical display. Instead, at the convention, he said, what was wanted and what had telling effect was truth, thought, reason, solid argument, and constructive ability. Now, Quick's approach was in stark contrast to what had happened earlier at the 1891 Constitutional Convention. The referendum there had been rejected by the Convention as a means of approving the Constitution or its future amendment. Sir Samuel Griffith argued strongly in favour of constitutional conventions. He did not think that a matter as complicated as a new constitution could be left to the people to decide in a vote because, he said, a very large proportion of electors would not be sufficiently acquainted with the Constitution before they voted upon it. A vote of the people, he thought, would not genuinely reflect their deliberate opinion. He thought a convention would better deal with the complex and detailed constitution. Now, in 1891, Griffith won the day against the arguments of people like Deakin and Kingston, who favoured the democratic merits of a referendum. But because of Quick's Corowa plan, the 1897 Constitutional Convention was directly chosen by the people. And that directly chosen convention knew that its work was going to be approved by the people in a referendum, or at least put to them. Now, this thoroughly undermined any argument for using conventions rather than a referendum for future amendments to the Constitution. If it was good enough for the people to approve the Constitution by referendum, it was good enough for them to have the final say on amending the Constitution through a referendum. Deakin and Quick, the men who had, decades earlier, been encouraged by Berry to take up the cause of federalism, succeeded in putting in place a referendum as a means of hearing the voice of the people when it comes to constitutional change. They did this at a time when a referendum was actually quite an exotic beast, and the people were not widely entrusted even with the right to vote, let alone the right to decide upon constitutional change. So the question here is, was Quick's faith in the people misplaced? Is constitutional reform too complex, as Griffith argued, so that it should just be left to experts? And the answer to this question, I think, and this is reflecting on the campaign that we've been going through here, is a lawyer's answer, which is yes and no. Experience has shown us that it is very hard to get constitutional change, particularly through a referendum. People can be easily bamboozled, not so much, I think, by complexity of the change, but often by misdirection, misinformation, exaggerations, and extreme imaginings portending doom arising from any change. In such an environment, they are susceptible to the rather insidious argument of don't know, vote no. But this is not a reason, I think, for confining constitutional reform to the hands of elites. It's really an argument for better education, particularly in schools, about our system of government and how our constitution works, so that the people have the basic tools to be able to identify arguments and be able to point them out when they are nonsense, and to have the confidence to be able to trust their judgment when it comes to fulfilling their responsibility to vote in a referendum. As a nation, we are contradictory in that we trust our people to determine our constitutional destiny, but we don't equip them to do so. Education on civics and citizenship, at least in my view, is haphazard and frankly woeful. I've seen years of evidence of this at university, with students coming into my class with not the faintest idea of how government and elections work, or worse, having completely wrong ideas about these things. Now, this has only become exacerbated in the era of social media, with people obtaining their information about current affairs and the world solely through an algorithm that keeps them contained in an intellectual silo. So I don't think that Quick's faith in the Australian people was misplaced, but I do think that governments need to do much more to support the people by giving them the knowledge that they need to understand the Constitution and the system of government under which they live, in an effort to inoculate them from the misinformation and the confusion that inundates us during a referendum campaign. By the time a referendum is in the offing, it's frankly too late to do this. You know, these ideas that we will put out a neutral education campaign, it's not enough. You need to have years of building upon understanding to get a good understanding of what you need to know about government and the Constitution. That really needs to be done in a structured way through schools. And apart from anything, by the time you get to a contested referendum, anything that the people are told by government is treated with suspicion. Education does need to be structured and built on systematically so that people do have a good understanding about how our system of government works. Now, even though I am probably one of the elite that would be making decisions about constitutional reform if such things were left to conventions to decide, personally I am a Democrat, by which I mean that, like Quick, I believe that such matters should be decided by the people. So in the short term, instead of succumbing to the slogan of "Don't know, vote no," I would strongly encourage people to follow an alternative slogan of "Not sure, learn more." As the framers put trust in us to make these decisions, I think the least we can do is repay that trust by making an effort to give an informed decision, whatever that decision may be. There are now lots of resources available to help people, including particularly from universities, law societies, and me. I should add that I have a YouTube channel called The Constitutional Clarion, and I have done lots of videos on almost any question that you may have had, and I am still adding to it because people keep sending me questions. So there are lots of sources. And the thing is that social media may on the one hand blight our lives with a cacophony of confusion. It also, on the flip side, makes it pretty easy to actually obtain access to authoritative and instructive resources. Key thing, though, is being able to be sufficiently discerning to identify what it is that you look at. Now, one of the arguments that has proliferated in recent times is that the voice is somehow incompatible with our Constitution because it treats one group of people differently from others. People say that our constitution requires everyone to be treated the same, but actually it doesn't. There are all sorts of differences built into the constitution, including guaranteed levels of political representation for the less populous states, which means that the vote of a Tasmanian is actually worth more in terms of representation than the voice of someone from Victoria. And there are good reasons for those differences. I'm not disputing them at all, but to say that the Constitution requires everyone to be treated the same is manifestly wrong. The High Court recognised in a case called McCloy in New South Wales that the Constitution's system of representative government, representative democracy, guarantees the people of Australia equality of opportunity to participate in the exercise of political sovereignty. Now, this is important for three reasons. First, it confirms that in Australia, sovereignty is held by the people, and that includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So collectively, sovereignty is popular sovereignty. Second, it recognises that all people should have an equal opportunity to exercise that sovereignty by participating in the political system, including by raising their concerns with the institutions of government, such as Parliament and the executive government, making representations to them. Third, the court recognised that equality has to be substantive rather than merely formal. It acknowledged that treating people the same when there are genuine differences between them does not necessarily result in equality or fairness. The High Court in McCloy accepted that for equality to be substantive, some voices may need to be quietened, and in that case it dealt with it by allowing there to be caps put on the donations, the political donations that people give, so that the voices of the really rich don't drown out everybody else. So some voices may need to be quietened in order that other voices can be heard. Now, a majority of the court said that the risk to equal participation posed by the uncontrolled use of wealth may warrant legislative action to ensure or even enhance the practical enjoyment of popular sovereignty. And Justice Gordon described this problem as being one of inequality of political influence. Now, their honours, and this was well before the voice debate arose, recognised a statement made by a Canadian judge that the state can equalise participation in the electoral process in two ways. First, the state can provide a voice to those who might otherwise not be heard. And second, the state can restrict the voices which dominate the political discourse so that others may be heard as well. Now, so far in Australia, some efforts have been made at the state level to restrict the voices of some so that others can be heard. So by putting caps on donations, restricting the ability of the very rich people to influence politicians, allowing the voices of others, third-party campaigners, community groups, etc., to be heard. But what we are now seeing with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice is the other side of the equation, enhancing the voices of those who might not otherwise be heard so that they can fully participate with equality in Australia's system of representative and responsible government, which finds its source in popular sovereignty. Now, this is not about giving special rights to anyone, because all persons in Australia, and indeed organisations as well, can make representations to Parliament and the executive government. I do it quite a lot, frequently because I'm asked to make submissions, etc. But we can all do that. But it would be addressing the inequality of political influence that currently exists by enhancing the influence of those who struggle to be heard. Now, we all know that in Australia there are some voices that have disproportionate influence on government. They include the voices of media moguls, those who make large donations to political parties, those who wield economic influence, such as miners or business groups or the ACTU, and those who wield organised social influence, such as churches and ethnic groups. Amongst all the loud voices and strong influences, it is hard to hear Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices. An organised voice with a permanent, stable existence and a defined function of making representations to Parliament and the Executive is one way to address that disadvantage and ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are able to enjoy what the High Court described as equality of opportunity to participate in the exercise of political sovereignty. It is intended to enhance substantive equality under our Constitution rather than to undermine it. Now, in conclusion, there is a bronze bust of Sir John Quick in the Gardens. We just went out and had a look at it, took a little photo with him. It's down that way and to the left towards the Military Museum. And if you look at it, because I imagine people who live here probably walk past it all the time and don't give it a second thought, but if you go and you have a look at it, you'll see his motto there. I'm reluctant to pronounce it because I don't have a classics background, and my husband would be appalled at my poor pronunciation of Latin, and I forgot to ask him how to pronounce it before I left. That was a fail. Anyway, it says, qui patitur vincit. He who perseveres conquers. And it seemed to me to be really fitting for a boy who worked in mines at the age of 10 and who designed the plan that brought about the federation of a nation and which gave all of us a voice in a referendum to change that constitution. It's also a fitting motto for those who are campaigning for a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Constitutional reform is hard. Setbacks are common, but he or she who perseveres will eventually conquer. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for taking us on quite the journey from Quick's early days through to this important decision that we are all making as sovereign members of Australian society, as part of Australia. We do have time for a few questions. Thank you for people who've been sending them through. The first one I'm going to amalgamate a few because there's been a common thread through a few of them. And that question is, I'll try to summarise it. You've talked about the faith that Sir John Quick had in the Australian people and the importance of us all having our voices heard in constitutional reform. Do you think that Quick would be disappointed with us as a nation and our apathy sometimes around these big issues? And a couple of questions came through around compulsory voting. In the absence of compulsory voting, how many people would participate? Have we lived up to his expectations of us?
That's a really hard question. Actually, we've got Sir John Quick sitting in the front row, by the way, who might have a view on this. I think he would be partly disappointed. I mean, he was a man of enormous drive and expectation. And he was a doer. I mean, this guy got out there, he was head of the Shakespeare Society and this, that and the other, he was on this board, whatever. He was full of vim and effort and enthusiasm, and I think he probably would find it quite hard to recognise that we could happily sit on our couch and binge watch television rather than paying attention to the world. But, you know, the thing is, the audience to whom I am speaking now are the people who will get off their couch and come in here and listen to someone and hopefully learn something. I think that the problem is that there are a lot of people that we are not getting through to, which I do find a bit disturbing. When it comes to compulsory voting, I'm quite torn about it because on the one hand I am a strong supporter of compulsory voting. I think it is really important because it takes away the influence of the extremes on both sides. So if you're in a country like America, etc., and you don't have compulsory voting, the people who come out to vote are those who are really motivated by extreme views. So you'll get the extremes on both sides and the people in the middle just don't end up participating and their voices aren't heard, and that means you get, you know, wild swings. You will get policies that you would never get coming up in Australia because in Australia politicians have to capture the centre when it comes to voting, whereas in other countries without compulsory voting they can actually get by you know, relying on the fringes. So from my point of view, I think compulsory voting in Australia is a great thing, it's really important, but it does make it very hard when it comes to a referendum. So you might have heard recently some complaints that the system was stacked against no or rigged against the no case. Actually, it's the opposite. The system is rigged against yes in a referendum, and it's rigged against yes in a couple of ways. One is internally from the Constitution itself, because you have to get not only a majority overall, but you've got to get a majority in a majority of states, and that can mean you can get, you know, 63% of Australians voting yes and it can still fail. That's happened before. So it is rigged against yes, but it's rigged against yes also because of compulsory voting, because all the people who just don't care and are not prepared to find out, they do tend to layer up the first, you know, 20 or 30% of the no vote, which makes getting a yes vote so much harder. So compulsory voting is very problematic from the point of view of a referendum and constitutional change. But on the other hand, would I get rid of it? I don't think I would, because I still think it is really important for everybody's voice to be heard. We need to push the people out into the polling booths, and we need to, you know, have that hope and trust that Quick did, that in those last moments, and it may just be while people are in the queue before they get to make their decision in the polling booth, but, you know, one can only hope that people will give serious thought to what is the right thing to do when they vote. So I think probably Quick would be a bit disappointed, but still in my heart I think I would prefer to trust the Australian people that in the end most people will try and be responsible and make a genuine decision.
Thank you. Given what you've just said about how hard it is to get a yes vote on any referendum topic, not just the voice, do you think that the model is the right one? Or did they make it too difficult?
You mean the model of our existing
model,
constitution? Yeah. It is funny, they did seem to think that it was going to be easier than it is or has turned out to be. So the framers of the constitution, there is a mixed view about it. So the referendum was an odd thing to put in the constitution back then. None of our comparative countries had it. The United Kingdom didn't use it, Canada didn't use it, the United States didn't use it, except in some of the states themselves, but not nationally. So it wasn't an English-speaking country thing that was done. So it was quite radical. It was taken from Switzerland. But the view was, at the time, that it was a conservative method. So the idea of asking the people to vote was that the people in voting would get rid of anything radical. So the idea was that the vote of the people was intended to be a conservative break on politicians doing crazy things. And to an extent it's true, and it's also quite helpful. I mean, I'm more than happy to have the Australian people as a break to stop politicians doing crazy things. I think that's important. But it was meant to be a conservative tool. And yet the people who put it in there still thought that there would be a lot more constitutional change than there ended up being. And, you know, even in terms of constitutional change through development in the High Court and those sorts of things, constitutional interpretation, the framers of the Constitution always expected the Constitution to change to meet the needs of the people of the day. And I think there's a real risk of getting trapped into this American notion that the Constitution is some kind of sacred document in a box that you can't touch, and that if you do touch it, you know, something like this terrible is going to happen, like in an Indiana Jones movie or something or other, and, you know, all of a sudden we'll sort of turn into skeletons or something. I mean, this is a sort of thing that's beginning to seep through the community. The people who wrote the Constitution were human beings. They weren't gods. The Constitution was intended by them to be changed. And the Constitution is supposed to be a thing that governs the times that we live in. It's not some historic thing that's frozen in time. And if we just get stuck with a constitution that's frozen in time because people are too scared to change it, then that in itself is probably a greater risk than actually doing any change to it. And what I mean there is that, you know, constitutions, when they get frozen and brittle, if there's any stress on them in a crisis, they tend to break and shatter and have to be completely replaced. But a flexible constitution, one that you can change over time to meet the needs of the people, is more likely to be an enduring constitution. So I think we do need to be really careful that we don't just, you know, put the Constitution in a cabinet, lock the key and go away and leave it there forever, because it will end up where people disrespect the Constitution because it no longer reflects the values and the life that they live, and then the Constitution becomes unable to operate properly in our society. So changing the Constitution and making it a constitution for our lives and our times is a very important thing.
Thank you. There's been a number of questions that have come through about education. So you spoke quite passionately about starting education early on. So there's references to, is it too boring? Schools are under-resourced. The curriculum doesn't tackle these issues. And I know this is actually a passion of yours, so I thought I might just give you the floor to talk about the work that you do with high school kids and how you make the Constitution interesting.
Oh, well, look, for me, the Constitution is the most interesting thing. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But, you know, the Constitution is all about power. Now, how can that not be interesting? Okay, how many people watch, you know, television shows like, you know, Succession and whatever because it's all about power? Well, ultimate power is the Constitution because it gives power to Parliament, to the government, to the courts, and it limits that power. It's the thing that puts the brakes on the power. It's the thing that stops the dictator taking over. It's the thing that separates out power so it's not all held in one set of hands. It's the thing that decides when governments can raise money from you and how they get to spend it. So the Constitution is inherently interesting. It's not some dry, dusty, boring thing. But in terms of education, yes, I have a very strong view that we need to do this much better in schools. To me, I think it's wrong that, you know, civics and citizenship is just the odd thing on the side that's not a proper dedicated subject, and you just put little bits of it into other people's subjects. So there's a little bit in history over here, and there's a little bit done in English over there, and there's a little bit over here. It's bitsy, and it means that nobody gets a sensible, proper, logically built up view of things. You know, I see these bits in curriculum and, you know, you discover, for example, they'll tell you things like, you know, oh, you need 3 readings to get a bill through each house. Well, you know, that's just boring as anything. I couldn't care less whether, you know, you don't need to tell people, oh, there's a first reading and a second reading. That's not what's essential. But then they go and they tell you nothing about government. They don't tell you about cabinet and how it works. They tell you nothing about the Prime Minister or any of those sorts of things. They'll just tell you the formalities of how you get a bill through Parliament. They don't tell you about how the system works in reality. At one stage, quite some many years ago, I was asked to review the civics and citizenship curriculum, and I wrote a report explaining how dreadful it was. And then, of course, no one did anything about it. And look, it's still dreadful. But the most dreadful thing about it is that there is no consistent year after year teaching of it to build up knowledge and expertise. Anyone who's had a child or a grandchild in school will know that they end up knowing far more about the American Constitution by watching television than they do about their own Constitution. And I just think that's a tragedy. And the other thing about it that really irks me is, particularly for people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, understanding government and how it operates is actually really crucial to your life if you're down the bottom of the heap. If you're the person who's trying to rely on government services, for example, and trying to navigate your way through what's done by the states and what's done by the Commonwealth, trying to work out how to deal with things when you've been hard done by, knowing, about the existence of the sort of integrity agencies and the ombudsman and the various resources of people that you can help you. It's just so important for people to understand how their government works and to be able to equip themselves to navigate government in their lives. So it's far more important for people who end up having to rely on government than it is for the richer people up the top. So I've done some work with a body called CEFA, Constitutional Education Fund Australia. I used to be a director of it. I actually ended up having to resign from it because they were being asked to run the neutral campaign for the referendum, and I thought that would be a conflict of interest with me saying things, so I left them. So I'm no longer a director of it, but I did a huge amount of material for them for open access material to be used in schools, which will hopefully soon go up on the Australian Constitution Centre website, and it's attached to, there is an Australian Constitution Centre in the High Court of Australia. If anyone's visiting Canberra, go check it out. So there's a lot more material around, but and some of it I did, and what I did I thought was very good, by the way. But the other side of public education is the YouTube channel thing I do as well, because I want it to be a little bit more accessible to people. I don't think I've captured the youth. I have not gone viral yet. I know what my demographics are, and it seems that 80% of the people who watch my YouTube channel are males over the age of 65. And I somehow suggest I'm rather speaking again to that demographic tonight. So I suggest you encourage your children and your grandchildren to check out my YouTube channel, and that might help my demographics to be a little bit broader. But yes, overall, Constitution, A, very exciting, all about power. B, something that we all really need to learn about, and to equip ourselves as citizens to be able to make the best of the country that we're in.
Sounds like we need to get you in front of a few classrooms. So I'm going to end with one final question, a difficult one, I think. But the question is, if passed, how will the Australian public know that the Voice is working? And how will members of the Voice feel if not all of their contributions are listened to?
Yeah. Okay, so the first thing is just to give you... All right, when we talk about the Voice, I think we need to do something, and that is to separate off what's legally required from what's politically political pressures, because this is where I think the whole thing's gone astray. So in relation to the Voice, when people say, oh, it's going to gum up government because, it's going to have to be consulted in advance and it will delay everything, all the rest of it. And we say, well, no, there's nothing in the amendment. There's nothing in there that actually requires the government to respond, that requires the government to listen, that requires the government to do what the voice wants. There's nothing even in there that says you have to consult in advance. There's just nothing in there that says that. And then people say, well, what is the point of doing it? A complete waste of time if there's nothing in there saying, that requires them to do that. So why are you doing it? Okay, it's the separation of law and politics. There's nothing in there that you can go to a court and say, government, you have to listen, right? What it's all about, and the whole way it's supposed to work, is politics and political pressure. So the first part of it is if the government is better informed, so if the government knows that if it puts this policy, or it's got a policy and it affects people in this particular place in this particular way and it's really dumb and they need to fix it, okay, then there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to actually fix it. And look, both sides have said they do want better outcomes, right? If they're better informed, you'd have to be really perverse then to say, I'm still not going to fix it. So one example, I was sitting next to Rachel Perkins at something, and she was saying that when they brought into effect the card, the cashless card that was used in the area from which she originally came, out in the, I think it was in the Northern Territory, they did so, and that particular card was not accepted for use in the only shop that provided food in the local community, so that all the women in the community who needed to shop had to pay for taxis to take them in a town a long way away to get food, and that half the money that they needed to spend on food was being spent on taxis. Now that's just completely insane, right? But it's a consequence of the fact that the people who make the rules aren't aware of the perverse outcome of the rules. Another perverse outcome is that people couldn't use the card to buy second-hand things like second-hand furniture, etc. So they all had to go out and buy new things because second-hand sellers wouldn't accept a card. They only accept cash. So there have to be ways of solving those sorts of problems. So the point of the voice is for communities to be able to say, look, you've got this law and policy and it might be there for a particular reason, but here are the 3 ways this is causing us grief that need to be fixed. Now at the moment, there are real problems in being listened to and heard about that because there's no proper structure for that to happen. So the point of the voice is a political point. It's not about the law saying, government, you have to do this. It's about people having a structure in which they can feed in from the ground their own experiences. They can give examples and they can say, this is what the problem is. Here's how we suggest you fix it. Now, if the politicians, when they get that information, and it's something that can reasonably be done to fix it, the politicians will know that if the voice is established in a referendum, the Australian people have told them, you have to fix this and give us better outcomes from Indigenous people, because that's the message that is going to come through from the referendum if it is successful. So politicians on all sides are going to have political pressure on them to respond to sensible suggestions to make sure that laws and policies in their application to Indigenous people work properly. All right? That's the way the system is supposed to work, and it's supposed to work by way of political pressure rather than legal obligation. Now, where the whole debate's gone completely askew is that everybody is focused on what's going to happen in the High Court, what's going to happen in, courts. Everybody's going to be running off to court and fighting and legal stuff. And that's not what it was designed to do at all. It was about giving a proper structure to allow Indigenous people in small communities to say, here are the problems that we face, have a mechanism to send that through to make sure that people can address it and fix it. It's about political pressure. It's about informing government so that it can do the right thing. It's not about running off to court and doing legal actions. And so that's the difference. So the question is, well, how will we know if it's working? Well, we'll know if people can say, actually, there were things that people raised and they were fixed. Now, is the government going to do everything the voice asks it? Well, no, it's not, because remembering the government and Parliament represents all of us. Right? It doesn't just represent 3% of the Australian people, it represents everyone. And there may be circumstances where people in the 3% say, well, we'd like this, thanks very much. And the government will say, well, we can't do that because we've got to deal with this entire budget, which has a whole lot of other things that we've got to deal with. And, you know, in the circumstances, we think it's appropriate to do these 17 other things and not that thing over there. All right, that's a choice that governments are going to have to make. They live in a democracy. They're the ones who get elected and chucked out at the next election by people, not just the 3%, but all of us. So governments will be able to say no to things. But where they are things that particularly affect Indigenous communities, that do not have any impact on anyone else, there'd be very little justification for a government to say, no, we're not going to listen to you on that. So it will really depend on the nature of the thing that's at issue. So yes, there will be times when the voice won't be listened to. Yes, there will be times when its advice is rejected. But hopefully there will be many times when what it tells the government does lead to a response because the government is better informed and can do better laws and policies regardless of who's in government.
Great, thank you. So we are unfortunately out of time for questions, but thank you for such generous answers. I really appreciate the depth that you went into in answering all of those questions. So please join me again in thanking Professor Anne Twomey.